Hi there. My name is Stefan Legault, and thanks so much for joining me today. I want to acknowledge that today I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Treaty 7 Nations. That's the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, as well as Métis Region 3 here in Alberta. Today I'll be reading to you from High Calls and Deep Canyons. I'm going to read to you from Chapter 1, which is a chapter called Raised by Blackflies, and Section 1, called The Porcupine Camp. I hope you'll consider supporting the project that I'm working on. It's an effort to publish this book, to promote this book through Indiegogo. And at the end, there'll be a little promo as well as information as to where you can go to support the project. Thanks so much. And once again, enjoy yourself, and I hope to hear from you at some point in the future. Chapter 1, Raised by Blackflies. Whenever I walk with a child, I think about how much I have seen disappear in my own life. What will there be for this person when he is my age? If he senses something ineffable in the landscape, will I know enough to encourage it? Barry Lopez, Crossing Open Ground, 1945 to 2020. In the beginning there were woods, rich and green, and stretching for as far as my imagination could reach. Pink domes of granite, worn gray by 10,000 winters. Lakes, dark green and seemingly bottomless. Fields crowded with tall grasses and wildflowers. Much of what we remember is not real, or at least the events did not happen the way we recall. I'm left with picture postcards, flashes of recollection in time frozen like Ilford Pan F, crisp but motionless, razor sharp but masked with contrasts. Between the ages of 5 and 11, I lived mostly in the small hamlet of Porcupine, outside of Timmins, Ontario, and for a short period of time in Elliott Lake, Ontario. In many of my experiences there, I concede to the flaws of recollection. The events in this section, as they relate to my adolescent zeal for nature, are almost certainly romanticized and exaggerated by time, what behavioral ecologists call leveling, sharpening, and assimilating. These memories have been subconsciously altered to fit into my worldview. What is real is the emotional signature of these events. The way an instant can tattoo a scent, a taste, a sound onto the heart and have it remain 40 years later. That embossed mark is the foundation of how I see myself in the world and how I see the world around reflected in me. It would be easy to write it as a straight line, a childhood in the woods, a teenager wrestling with despair and loneliness, finding comfort among trees, a young man discovering a much larger world in the mountains, and then, after having children myself, rediscovering the value of wilderness through them. That's not a story, though. Life is not arrow straight. We're going to take a little time and a few hundred pages to navigate our way to the end of this narrative. The journey begins in Porcupine. Part 1, The Porcupine Camp. In what might be a Canadian adaptation of Rudyard Kipling's book, The Jungle Book, I was raised in the woods of northern Ontario by a swarm of blackflies. This may explain why I grew up to be such a pest. In Kipling's 1894 collection of stories, the boy Mowgli strays from his village and after being attacked by the tiger Shere Khan is rescued and raised by wolves in the Indian jungle. I too wandered away, and in my case developed over the last 40 years or so an unhealthy, nearly compulsive dependence on wild places for my well-being. Based on a strong, though occasionally declinationally challenged moral compass and an almost priggish sense of justice, my upbringing in the woods of the north was not so different from Mowgli's. Whereas Mowgli's was taught to triumph over adversity and respect both law and freedom, I too learned to face adversity, namely my own inner demons, but also those which threaten the things I love, and to respect nature and creativity. My family on my father's side settled in Pamour, a mining community east of the city of Timmins, Ontario, my mother was raised in Schumacher, another mining settlement that was a satellite of the same locale. Both families were a blend of French and Irish, with French dominant on my father's side and Irish on my mom's. Both of my grandfathers worked in the mines. Tom, my mom's dad, was a security guard until his untimely death at the age of 44 from a heart attack. Lucien was a plumber and tinsmith who worked underground for more than 40 years, bringing the air in and pumping the water out of the deep stopes and shafts of the Pamour gold mine. I wasn't born in Northern Ontario. That dubious honor belongs to the Montreal West Island suburb of Dollard-des-Ormeaux. My father had been transferred to Montreal for work, and while all the rest of our lives, Sharon and Bob had lived in small-town Northern Ontario, I was born in the big city. It was not long, however, before we were back in the north. Next to a varied assortment of half-remembered, half-imagined experiences that involved playgrounds, a visit to the hospital for a split head, and interactions with kindly old neighbors, my first recollections are of the woods, the lakes, and the fields of the north. Shortly after my sister was born, my family bought 10 acres of third-growth forests and fallow fields in the charmingly named town of Porcupine. Porcupine was a gold mining camp founded by Noah Timmins in 1906. The community experienced a short-lived boom when it began producing gold in 1909. Until fire obliterated the entire town just 2 years later, it looked as if the gold camp might grow to overtake Mr. Timmins' namesake as the dominant town in the region. When we moved from Schumacher to the city of Quills, my folks sold a few acres for subdivision and built a home on a parcel of land that remained. Porcupine was roughly equidistant between Schumacher and Pamour, and our land backed onto a vast stretch of woods that as a child I imagined reached undisturbed to Hudson's Bay, 800 kilometers to the north. It was pretty close to the truth, though there were a few highways, a few towns, and a reasonable amount of industrial activity. It would be possible to draw an unbroken line through the spruce woods and granite outcrops, with only a few deviations. The formative years of my life, between the ages of 5 and 12, were spent with a vast, wild place as my playground. I sometimes wonder how different my life would have been had I stayed in Montreal. While it's possible to develop the sort of relationship with nature I did while growing up in the city, I wonder what would have been different if my mother had not insisted on moving back to the north when I was 3. My father reminds me from time to time that as a child I was anything but adventurous. Though we still spent a great deal of time outdoors, I was terrified of heights, water, anything that grew in water, bees, most insects, outhouses, slugs, beaches, walking on gravel barefoot, and I was prone to sunburns and hives. While I've been told many times that I was much happier with a book in my hands or a piece of paper and pencil, most of my memories of childhood involve nature. Our backyard was hacked and mown out of what had most recently been Mr. Vassey's hayfield, and it quickly reverted to a meadow of tall grass, wildflowers, aspens, and the aforementioned bees. There was a 2-lane track that led through our property at one of Mr. Vassey's active fields, and on to pine and spruce woods beyond. That fading road was the passageway into a wild childhood. The dense stands of willow that bordered that track became playhouses and forts. My sister Chantal and our friends could huddle in the hollow of those spring branches, surrounded by the soft catkins we called pussy willows, hidden from the world around us. Over time, says Gary Paul Navhan and Stephen Trimble in The Geography of Childhood, I've come to realize that a few intimate places mean more to my children and others than all the glorious panoramas I could ever show them. Because I sense their comfort there, their tiny hand-shaped shelter has come to epitomize true intimacy for me. Here was that first feeling of solace, of seclusion with wild nature. We were hidden away in a space just the right size, to feel the initial stirring of a connection with the wild. Northern Ontario was a perfect place for such an experience because while it is vast, it is fashioned of a million such child-sized pockets that are easy to grasp and feel a sense of familiarity with. Venture further to where a thicket of taller trees was clumped along the road, and we found a nest of robins. My sister and I brought our mother, Sharon, to that place, and together we peered into the basket-like nest at the clutch of pale blue eggs there. Mum taught us not to disturb these nests for fear that the birds' mothers would abandon their young, something she may have considered herself from time to time. Further up the track were the willows that lined an intermittent creek, and whose broad spreading boughs came to support all manner of fort, spaceship, and living accommodation. We dragged plywood up that road, 3 or 4 of us struggling in turns to manage the lumber, the hammer, and a pocket full of nails, using it to build the foundation of our construction projects. It seemed like that clutch of willow was leagues from our home, when in reality our mother could and frequently did watch us from an upstairs window. Beyond the intermittent creek and the willows was the climbing birch, and then Mr. Vassey's fields, and then the deep woods. While all the rest of this was merely natural, those woods were wild. Not wilderness, not by any stretch, but wild enough that just about anybody could feel that they were apart from the rest of the world, and we certainly did. By the time I was 8 or 9, I was wandering into that wild country on my own, following clear trails and my instincts for direction. At the time, I didn't know it, but I was beginning to delineate between wilderness, wildness, and nature. Nature for me is any place you might find, however small, that is unhindered. This might include green spaces free of lawns and baseball diamonds, where trees and shrubs and flowers and grasses grow at their will, but it might also be bisected by hardened walking trails. My sanctuary woodlot behind my home in Burlington was nature. Too small to support anything more than a few deer and a gang of rowdy squirrels and birds, it was nevertheless natural in feel. It was possible to find a reprieve from urban life there. Wild country is a place that is large enough to support a few additional critters and has been left largely to its own on its own devices, or has been abandoned to revert back to the wild after having been farmed or logged. The vast woods outside my back door in Porcupine were wild country. Mr. Vassey's farm and the second growth and third growth forests there felt wild as a kid, and I think they probably would still today. There were power poles a few miles north of our home, but otherwise very few developments to detract from the wild nature of the place. Wilderness I reserve for big tracts of land and water untouched by people, left on its own to function as it pleases. Wilderness is, in the classic definition from the United States, an untrammeled area by man. It's got to be big, and within the boundaries of such a place, man is merely a visitor who does not stay. Bear in mind that the Act was written in 1964, when gender neutrality was still sometime in the future. For example, many, though not all, of our national parks in Canada fall into this category, at least where we haven't created tourist traps of them. The vast reaches of Banff and Jasper National Park east of the highways, where few trails penetrate and where wildlife and wild processes are allowed to play out their natural rhythms, those are wilderness. Places such as the hiking trails around my own stomping grounds in Lake Louise are wild country. And the areas around the town sites I consider nature at best. Many of the places I might describe as wilderness are areas that are becoming wild again after previous exploitation. No doubt I've naively sat in woods somewhere and considered them wilderness without knowing that a century before they'd been logged. It's about his feeling as much as anything else. My response is as much a part of my definition as anything. If you were to take a city kid and plunk her down at the edge of the Banff town site, she might consider it wild country or even wilderness, whereas I might think of it as, quote, just nature. This is a subjective definition, one that leaves a lot of room for personal interpretation and bears little resemblance to the official definition of wilderness used in the U.S. under the Wilderness Act, or here in Canada as designated under federal national parks legislation. There were bears in those wild woods in northern Ontario, something we learned when the Ministry of Natural Resources trapped one just 100 feet behind our home. That morning, every kid within a kilometer was in our backyard, unsupervised, and with nary a conservation officer in sight. I played town crier, alerting the neighbors. When the school buses arrived, the befuddled drivers could only lay on their horns to avert our attention away from this curiosity. There were skunks too, something our white toy poodle named Puff learned the hard way. Repeated washing in tomato juice improved both his and my standing in the neighborhood. What kid doesn't want a pink poodle? Every Christmas, my parents invited all of their friends to our home, and we went on an annual Christmas tree hunt. This usually involved a few people with snowmobiles packing the track for a kilometer or two into the woods, where the rest of the merrymakers would venture overland to a designated site. A bonfire, hot dogs, hot chocolate for the kids, and beer and wine for the adults were accompanied by Christmas carols in a grove bordered by granite domes and snow-laden trees. The snowmobiles later pulled the trees back to our place, and the adults staggered along their paths to resume their merriment around the fireplace in our home. One of my clearest memories from that time was being allowed, at the age of 7 or maybe 8, to walk back home on my own. It could not have been more than a kilometer or two from our bonfire site to the house, but as a kid, I felt like David Thompson on his overland journey across North America. The sensation of being alone in the winter wilds was piercing, so much so that I can still feel the cold on my face and the hard-packed snow under my boots. One of my parents' friends, likely Cantor June McGuinness, was good enough to send along a wine flask with me, instructing me not to drink it. That was helpful. By today's standards, my sister and I were given outrageous free rein as children. In recollection, it seems that we were booted out the door first thing in the morning to run wild through the woods, through our neighbors' yards and up and down Government Road on our bikes, until someone's parents fed us lunch. The afternoons were a repeat of the same, playing in sandboxes and dipping a fishing line into a foot-wide creek, exploring the second and third growth dog-haired forest between our home and Mr. Vassey's barn. After dinner, we would repeat this dreamlike childhood routine once more, with games of hide-and-seek, cowboys and Indians, Starsky and Hutch playing out across an unruly stretch of northern Ontario's bush. As our backyard was just a few acres of mown weeds, my parents tilled up a 1,000-square-foot garden plot and invited 3 other families to share in the work. At the end of a long, hot summer day in the garden, we'd often kindle a fire in a pit my father and I had built and sit up late into the night, the sparks from the fire merging with the ribbons of green aurora high overhead. It was not uncommon to find half a dozen kids tearing around in the shadows cast by that fire at 2 a.m. in the morning. Most summer days, however, would end before the sun went down. This always struck me as unfair during the Arctic-like summer days, though less so during the brief winter periods of daylight. At day's end, in the long half-light that falls in summer in the north, I would lay with my head at the foot of the bed, closest to the open window, and listen to the cacophony of crickets in the fields and forests beyond. Sometimes that chorus would fall silent all at once as a snake or some other predator moved through the grasses, then slowly rise again when the danger had passed. The night song of my childhood is that wild choir singing as the sun melted away from another idyllic day. Thank you. And thanks for considering supporting my Indiegogo campaign to produce, publish, and promote High Calls and Deep Canyons, Ordinary Adventures in Extraordinary Places.